the example I use in the paper is about using conceptual metaphors possibly to chase citations. So they're just a fancy term with nothing sitting behind them, and you're just deploying them to chase citations and social media activity. So I think asking these questions really gets us to the utility of urban theory. Like, what did we use urban theory for? And the purpose of urban theory and the purpose of these conceptual metaphors is to take us somewhere, to show us something new about something, to show us new empirical tracks in our work, or to show us something we didn't know conceptually about an issue, or to open up sort of new lines of sight in things.
I hope you're listening closely, Michele. Have you been careful with your metaphors recently, with all your gorillas, ants and dragons?
Yeah, I feel like I really need to rethink my approach to titles, and Dallas really changed my mind here. G'day, I'm Michele Couto.
And I'm Caitlin Morrissey, and in this episode we're talking elites, spooky metaphors, urban sounds and archives with Dallas Rogers.
Welcome to the mini-series Walking the City With, hosted by the Urban Studies podcast. This is a series all about the people behind the ideas in urban research. We get them out of the lecture room, out of their books and their articles, and we walk the talk with the authors and editors in urban studies.
And to be clear, we're literally out in the city on a walk with these authors. And it's a special podcast because it's the world's first for urbanists. This series is actually peer-reviewed, so the content must be good.
It's a certified treat.
So who are you out with this time, Michele?
So this is a bit of a Halloween episode, basically. We went out with Dallas Rogers, who's an associate professor of urban studies and head of urbanism in the School of Architecture, Design and Planning at the University of Sydney. But I guess much more importantly for this, he's the urban podcast maestro. Dallas's work has grappled with the contemporary politics of land, housing, property. Has touched on colonial issues, race, class, markets, and more. But before you do any of that, go and listen to him and the City Road podcast, an absolute classic on all kinds of things urban sounds, and do that after you've listened to this episode, of course.
And that's essential. But Michele, how did Dallas get into urban studies?
Well, let's just jump into the walk and hear it from him. But suffice to say that prompting again an urban studies scholar to walk the question of how he got into global urbanism took us first on a personal journey, but also straight into how we speak about urban studies globally today. So lots about the words that we use. Unsurprisingly, perhaps, for a podcasting and radio pro, but also quite helpfully, I think, as a reflection on how our urban theory and our urban practice terminology travels and echoes here and there. So let's hear it from Dallas.
And as usual, a quick disclaimer that this series is really out there, so beware. You may hear tradies hammering, planes flying by, chatty passers-by, cracking leaves, but let's go.
Let's go.
Like everybody, I imagine, in a roundabout way, my undergrad degree is in international aid work. So I did an international aid work degree. Then in the last 6 months of that degree, I had to do an international placement to complete that degree, and I ended up getting a posting in Sri Lanka and went there for 6 months. And at the end of that project, my degree was finished. I ended up staying on there for about 3 years. And a little bit of that job was actually looking at land issues to do with the NGO I was working for, and had been allocated some land by the government, and there were tensions over who owned that. When I got back to Australia and I wanted to do some more studies, I took the kind of cross-cultural kind of skills that I'd developed in negotiating kind of with government around land, and then I started working on the Bonnyrigg public housing redevelopment, which is the first public-private partnership of a public housing estate in New South Wales, and it involved cross-cultural kind of consultation in that project because it's Bonnyrigg is a place where lots of refugees and migrants land in Australia, and it was extremely culturally diverse over many generations. So all of the consultations the state government was doing with that community were in at least 7 languages. So I kind of got interested in urban studies by being interested in sort of cross-cultural communication, really. And then once I got into the substance of that project, which was about public housing redevelopment and using public-private partnerships, I kind of fell into urban studies.
Falling into urban studies? Haven't we heard that before in the episode with Julie Wren?
Yeah, I wonder if there's a bit of a theme popping up here that we didn't expect. And I have to say, should we be worried of all these people falling as I take them out on a walk? So fingers crossed. Let's go back out with Dallas.
I think I'm interested. Well, let me take you actually. Is the bit on spooking urbanism?
Oh, yeah.
It sounds like you've been arguing and you put together that forum to sort of argue that we should take it seriously, that sort of the metaphor is a serious affair. So should we be afraid of the metaphors? And how do we take that seriously and not tongue-in-cheek?
Yep. So I think the interesting thing about any conceptual metaphor, but the ones I was using there was these spooky conceptual metaphors. So vampire urbanism and Dracula urbanism and the vampire index, is that they show us something interesting, I think, about concepts themselves. I think there's a little bit of something metaphoric in all conceptual work we do. And in fact, probably the most contentious thing I argue in that sort of paper is that maybe even gentrification is metaphoric, has a metaphor element to it. So it takes this landed gentry, historical group of people, and actually turns them into a conceptual tool that we can use to analyse something today. So what I want to do is just literally take that serious, take this conceptual metaphor seriously and think about what it's doing. And then sort of drill into, well, what do these spooky and other conceptual metaphors do? What work are they doing? And to ask that question is to kind of think about, if they're not doing any conceptual work or they're not opening new empirical avenues for us, then, you know, what's their kind of utility? So that was the kind of seesaw I was riding in this tension between asking what conceptual work, conceptual metaphors do for us, what sort of questions they open up, and then prompting a danger in not letting conceptual metaphors be, I call them empty, they're in a danger of being empty signifiers in urban studies. So they're just, well, the example I use in the paper is about using conceptual metaphors possibly to chase citations. So they're just a fancy term with nothing sitting behind them, and you're just deploying them to chase citations and you know, social media activity. So I think asking these questions really gets us to the utility of urban theory. Like, what do we use urban theory for? And the purpose of urban theory and the purpose of these conceptual metaphors is to actually to take us somewhere, to show us something new about something, to show us new empirical tracks in our work, or to show us something we didn't know conceptually about an issue, or to open up sort of new lines of sight in things. So that article really was just an invitation to think about this metaphoric work that concepts do, and to think about how they open up sort of push urban studies forward in a way, and to point to the dangers of the attention economy and social media and these things which I worry sometimes can get in the way of our work if we start to chase citations or to chase social media activity. And I'm all for, one, conceptual metaphors. I love them. I think play with language is like great. You know, sometimes academic work is a little bit tedious and sometimes writing can be a bit mechanic, and I think that, you know, having some fun with words and concepts and ideas and literature is a great thing to do. And it's equally with social media. I think it's amazing that we can share our work and build these communities, but we just do need to be careful of that those things don't take over the purpose of urban studies and urban theory, and that's actually to open up more information about things that we didn't know before.
Ed, I took you to a cemetery. So we're going to go inside of the cemetery.
Nice.
Wait, you took him to a cemetery? This is spooky.
It's totally spooky, but I really wanted to double down and ask him about his recent work. That is all about deal making, and what's better than a deal with the devil. So let's talk about deal and deals in urban development with elites.
The idea of unsolicited urbanism, which is, one of these conceptual metaphors, if you like, one of these conceptual tools that we'll just pop through the gate here.
Yep, the Holy Trinity.
And when we're doing that work, so this is work that Chris Gibson and Crystal Legacy and I have been doing independently and together. So we came to this sort of these ideas independently, and then we started talking about them, and we put them together in a couple of papers now. And we were just actually finding that the conceptual tools that we had, the theories of urbanism that were being used to critique urban governance processes, so things like neoliberalism, etc., just weren't really getting to the heart of this thing that we were observing. There was just something slightly different about it. And so we started talking about it, and it was this idea of the deal that kind of came to the center. So, and a particular type of deal making. It's a deal making that exists at a very high level, that cuts across the public and private sector, that is occurring behind closed doors and is affecting the very high profile, very sort of once in 100-year urban development sites in places like Sydney and Melbourne. And so we wanted to really draw attention to that, to this space of elite actors. So you have a politician and a few bureaucrats from government in the most powerful departments, Treasury, etc. You have a couple of consultants from the very big consultancy firms. You have some of the big private sector infrastructure players in a room nutting out a deal for in the case of Sydney, Barangaroo, this sort of once in 100-year former industrial site turned, mega development on the edge of the CBD with literally half the site is water frontage, Sydney Harbour views, amazing site. And the deal that went down for that happened, well, first of all, there was an public international design competition for that site, and somebody won it, and there was a plan in place. And then over the top of this comes a deal that was negotiated behind closed doors with just a few actors. And so we developed this idea of unsolicited urbanism based off the policy mechanism that literally got created at that site to make this happen, which is part of this, the creation of new regulatory tools and policies to legitimate the processes that they're literally making up on the spot. So, yeah, I think unsolicited urbanism and this deal making are just conceptual ideas that we've come about through working our way through the empirical material and through these sites to try to tell us something about what's happening in these sites that we just didn't think some of the other conceptual tools were allowing us to do or really getting to the heart of it. So
something that the paper sort of narrative about the deal that made me think You've done tons of work on sort of that international globalized dimension. And what was in the back of my mind is when you talk about the deal and the boardroom and the consultant doing the deal, that sort of earlier writing of yours where that's not even done in a boardroom in Sydney. We're talking a boardroom somewhere, Singapore, Hong Kong, or somewhere else. So I wonder if you can just reflect on what was that trajectory? How did you get from that global to the deal? Back to it.
Well, there's two answers to that. But an interesting one is I started researching urban poverty, right? And then I read this amazing quote from an archival document somewhere that's stuck up in my office. And it basically says something along the lines of, if you want to know about poverty, you need to look at wealth, basically. So that actually flipped me from researching public housing to researching the global super rich. And then I did the work, obviously, on foreign real estate investment into Australia. And there was large amounts of Chinese capital coming into Australian real estate for a period of time. And the Barangaroo development's not disconnected from that. In fact, part of the justification for the Barangaroo development was that they were going to attract high roller Chinese capital into the casino they were going to build there. And indeed, they were going to sell off some of the residential real estate to international developers. So there's this whole new logic of globally mobile Asian capital. And Australia, of course, is uniquely placed in that landscape. We are geographically part of Asia, but culturally, in some ways, traditionally, or at least since the colonial invasion, been connected to European kind of financial systems and capital and stuff. So there's an interesting shake-up happening, we think, in terms of cultural and financial capital landscape there. And so the whole Barangaroo starts to be justified in these foreign capital terms.
So we're back again in the Chinese boardrooms and hearing about the foreign direct investment that has been shaping parts of Sydney, in this case Barangaroo, from a distance. This kind of reminds me of what we heard with Julie Wren and Shen Jinghe.
Yeah, I think what you get with Dallas is that beautiful dance of the geopolitics of urban development, and we are here on country, deeply embedded, and then we get out there in the real estate markets and flows. And in a way sort of reminds us to be back in here and think about our own practice and the way we do urban research, right?
And to think about the term in here in a different way. We're back in the studio now. But while you were with Dallas, did you get the chance to ask him about his thoughts on podcasting and its role in his work?
Let's just say I continuously fretted about the quality of my audio and incessantly checked my levels for the radio nerds out there that know what that means. But I should also say this wasn't just a foray out of our mini-series theme of walking the city or self-indulgence that the two of us wanted to get into with a podcasting pro rather than talking walking global urbanism. Rather, I guess what we were both interested to hear from Dallas about is why podcasting, and because of the work that Dallas spurred amongst many of us amateur urban podcasters during the pandemic, where it gathered a wide cast, let's say, of urban scholars and reflected on the noises of the streets that had been disappearing back in 2020, 2021, as cities locked down across the world. So I guess what we're about to jump into and what we were interested in hearing about is basically what we do here in our mini-series and seeing how podcasting and sounds more generally contribute to a global urban conversation, especially when you get out on the streets. So take it away, maestro. Let's go on the street.
So I take the view of academia, particularly in the research space, but not only research and teaching. We're in the job of producing information and dispensing and sharing information. That's what we do. That's what an academic is. They read about stuff, they talk to people, they analyse data, they write stuff up, and then they share that information, that new knowledge with people. That's fundamentally, I think, what we do. And I just see this as a part of that. This is just, and of course sound and radio and podcast work is not for everyone. It is technically complicated. It requires equipment, it requires you to know the equipment, it requires planning. What works in a paper doesn't always work when we're talking. It needs to be more conversational like this. So, so I think that it is challenging, but I just see it as an amazing way to do a couple of things. Share information with people, share the work you've been doing and with other people, which I think actually is part of, what we're here for. But another thing it can do is it can build new types of communities, little micro-polities around things. So here are you and I sitting in a park going for a walk, talking about urban studies, and we mightn't have ever had this conversation in this way. We wouldn't have had this conversation if we were in the RGS right now on a panel, right? So it just opens up different types of conversations. And so I'm just really interested in that, like what new ways can we talk about things? And I'm really interested in like building little communities of people. So podcasting, like my City Road podcast is just me talking to other people about their research. It's not about me, it's not about my research. It's just about I'm really interested in what other people are doing, and it's just me asking them about their amazing research. And I learned so much from doing that as well. So I think there's a collective element to this that I find is really, really interesting. And I would say Twitter a few years ago was the same. I was really getting into like building little micro communities on Twitter. I think the Elon Musk thing has like scarred that a little. Someone said it's like it's like dying a slow death, and I kind of get the feeling that's true. So, but anyway, I think that's the utility of the digitization of academia is there's a lot of things that can be problematic. Tech can start to rationalize us and count us in new ways and count our outputs, but we can co-opt these technologies and build our own things. And it's going to take universities a while to catch up. Like, no one workloads me for making a podcast, and there's no metric that I can put podcasts in that makes it a productive thing to do in a kind of bean counting sense. But I think that it's utility is perhaps, I hope, valued in other ways. And so I'd like to go to the tech, and I studied radio and I take it seriously and I get all fussy about levels and stuff, but that's not what podcasting is about. People make them on their phones, and so I think the democratization element I think is just really awesome, and I just think that the more people that make podcasts, the better. And if it's an interesting conversation, you put up with like some problems with the audio. So yes, get good gear and learn as much as you can, but also don't be scared to just like jump in and give it a go.
We're giving it a go, and we're back in the studio. So at the end of each episode, we ask our authors to tell us about a place that is significant to them, to their work and their thinking. But Michele, where did Dallas take you?
Yeah, I didn't expect this one at all, and I probably didn't do my homework the right way, but it took us to a beautiful metaphor, I guess, and beautiful place. He took us to a quiet place and talked about quietness with an edge. He took us to archives. So let's go to an archive with Dallas.
Take us to a place.
Okay, I've been spending a lot of time in the archive lately, and to be in an archive is a really amazing experience. The more time you spend there, the more sort of amazing it gets. For a start, archivists, the people who work in archives are just the most amazing people who are just there, extremely skilled and know those archive materials so well, but are just so generous with their time and their knowledge. So I just love being in a space where people just love ideas and love research and love sharing that knowledge. But it's also just a very interesting space itself. It's a place where these old materials from the past that contain so many stories are just coming in and out of trays into these spaces. You can I love looking around the room and trying to like guess what people are doing. It's like, oh yeah, there's a person over there, clearly professor of history, very serious writing this. There's a PhD candidate over there, I can tell, stuff everywhere, In the corner there is the retired group of 5 people that come there every week to do family histories, and if you need anything about family histories, there's that crew. There's professional historians that move in and out who are just doing piecework, who are also great. And yeah, I just think these are, in terms of a fieldwork site, it's just an amazing space to be in. And the idea of quietness in these places is really interesting. So like a library, there is a quietness, but it's a quietness with an edge, because you can only make certain types of noises. And I'm quite interested in talking about sound, the types of noises. So you can't talk, but you can rustle materials, and you can, open your computer and you can type, which typing is a pretty annoying sound sometimes, but all of those are acceptable, but, talking too loud. So I kind of really love the space of the archive at the moment.
And out of the archives, back into the studio. What's your main takeaway there, Caitlin?
So there's 2 things that I really took away from what I heard from your conversation with Dallas today. There's something that sat with me, and then there's something that Dallas said about podcasting, which I'll reflect on in just a moment. But the thing that sat with me was what Dallas said about the role of conceptual metaphors in our work, and the danger of them becoming empty signifiers. And I think what struck me about that is just perhaps the call to be reflexive about the sorts of terminology and metaphors we use to explain and explore different urban phenomena and processes, and try to reveal them and make them visible. I thought that was really helpful for thinking through some of the work and writing that we do. The second thing that struck me, obviously talking to Dallas, who's a podcast maestro, as I heard you say a few times throughout the episode, is that it was particularly fascinating to hear about Dallas's thoughts on the role of podcasting in creating micro communities, and also the democratization of knowledge sharing, because podcasting can be quite a tech-light enterprise. And something that I hope is true, which I heard Dallas say, is that people will be forgiving of noise and interference, and possibly the sound of gates, and possibly the sound of children shouting in the background, if they're interested in the content that they hear. And more than anything, I just hope that that's true. But what did you take away from this, Michele?
Yes, I really hope that that's true. And I think I really like that warm embrace from someone that has done so many of these whilst we adventure into this. And how he speaks, and I think he speaks about that as much as he speaks about urban theory more in general, that we're in the job of producing and dispensing information. We're collectives, and there's a collectiveness, he says, in doing this, and an effort at democratizing the medium for the urbanist. And I really liked that, because it really reminds you that you need to get in there, but you get in there as a community. And aside from that, there's that quote about the quietness with an edge that really sits with me. But there's also another beautiful quote that he had, and he said, to understand poverty, you need to look at the elites, and you need to get out there. And I think this is the episode that really pushes me and says, I really want to get out there. I have to get out there, and hopefully people are forgiving of my background noise, sounds, and creaks. So with that, there you have it. Dallas Rogers and his Elites, Vampires, Archives, with a bit of a teaser of his work on sounds, on geopolitics of capital, on housing, and so much more to dive into.
And if you want to read and hear more about Dallas's work in urban studies, do take a peek through our show notes for some links, including our link to the City Road podcast, and dive in. So until the next adventure out, thanks for listening, thanks for walking the city with us and with Dallas.
Walking the City With is a mini-series by the Urban Studies Journal with the University of Bristol and the University of Melbourne, produced by Caitlin Morrissey in Manchester, Julia Macbeth in Glasgow, Kate Murray in Melbourne, and myself, Michele Acuto, in Bristol. Thank you for listening.